morning, everybody, and welcome to the Mitchell Sentinel podcast. Today, we're going to discuss Artie Brown's and Sons sawmill up at Antone. Yeah, it's compiled a little bit of research, and as a lot of folks know, that it's kind of a three-pronged stool, or three-legged stool, that this country was founded on, this area. Logging, mining, and ranching. But anyways, Dad, what do you got to say about Artie Brown and Sons?
Well, that's, we had some natural resources around here with all the timber and everything, and as more people moved in, they needed to build their dwellings or stores, and actually the lumber mill crossed with the mining because they needed timbers and stuff to build their stamp mill sites. They needed shoring for their mill, for the mines, so they could tunnel back in and get to the gold. So it kind of corresponds with everything. But Martin Morissette, it took about 3 or 4 years of doing some pretty extreme research, and he copyrighted his book in 2005. It's called Green Gold, and it tells a lot of the tales and stories of the lumbering industry in this area, Crook County, Grant County, and
Basically just like the Central Oregon, Central East.
Yeah, right. But they had, he started out to write a thing just on Hudspeth, but once he got into this thing, he found there was so much more stuff than milling and lumbering, and how it correlated with the rest of the history and everything. So he started with all this stuff. So he got into it, and I guess the milling industry probably started. Is starting to get settled here pretty good in the 1870s, and so I'm thinking right at the turn of the century, the milling industry was probably coming up to a little more happening in this area. So
and at that time, wasn't there probably about 5 or 6 mills just within the small vicinity of Mitchell, right?
Well, that kind of came a little bit later. I think probably in the late 30s, early 40s. That's when most of the big mills moved in. But at the time, little family-owned mills were operating, and that's where Artie Brown came into the picture. First, they started with what they call a whipsaw kind of an operation, where they'd bring the log in and they'd kind of put it in a cradle, and then they'd get up on top, and they had this great big saw, and then they'd saw this thing down. It was all hand work. But later on, they came...
Was it like a huge crosscut saw?
Yeah, huge crosscut saw, and they'd drag it up, push it down, drag it up, push it down. Pretty extreme work. Up until that time, most of the cabins around here were made out of logs, kind of piled and scattered around and put together. But then came the steam engine, and they used a lot of the natural resources, the same waste from the mill to
power the
steam and everything, and get the thing going. The steam had to power some sort of a thing that we could turn that energy into a round energy to run the saw. And most of these saws were probably round. They went to the bandsaw later. They were a little more efficient and everything.
That was probably like in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, that's when it really got
really
going.
Took off.
Yeah.
Well, I noticed, though, that a lot of these old homesteads you find up all these canyons that we've talked about before, they're boards. They aren't log cabins.
No, they. But
so there had to be some sort of mill industry or around that time, of the Homestead Act, I would think, or shortly after, and that's probably what perpetuated it, I would assume.
Yeah, partially. They did. Now, Artie Brown, he first had his mill set up someplace over, I think it was 6-shooter, probably between Richmond and Waterman Flat. And he set it up there, and at that time it was easier to move the mills around from one place to another than it was to get the logs to the mill. So that dramatically changed when the trucks and everything else came into play.
So they were just they'd set up the mill and bring the logs a short distance to the mill, and then they would probably move the lumber from there to wherever it was distributed.
They would usually what they did, rather than use a pond to preserve the logs, they would just bring into the mill what they were going to cut that day, so they would not dry out and crack and everything. And so they'd mill everything, and then they'd stack it, and it'd be stickered, and then it would be air dried, and that way it would just kind of season itself. And most of them, they didn't have no planers back in those days, so everything was pretty rough.
Rough sawn. And so they would just they would fall the timber that they would need to mill that day.
Right.
So it wouldn't dry too quickly. Okay.
Well, Artie Brown, between 1907 and 1910, the mill was at 6-shooter, and they needed at that time, Walden was a big growing town, city, whatever, and then Richmond was also there. So they had customers set up, and they needed to build schools and churches and stuff. That's usually what they did first, or barns. Sometimes they built the barn before they built the house, because they without the animals,
you wouldn't need to.
Yeah, they wasn't going to make it here anyhow. So they settled, and like I said, first he cut a lot for Richmond and Walden, and they called it Little Tennessee because most of the people in Richmond and out in that 6-shooter area, they were all from Tennessee. And after a while, Brown, he moved his mill from 6-shooter to Antone. And I think the reason being that he'd probably supplied quite a bit of the lumber to that all the market was pretty much used up. And also he had a daughter, and the daughter, she married into a family called the Millers. And Shoot Miller, he had a mill at between 6-shooter and Richmond. And so I think he decided that might be, it was getting too close together, and by that time his timber was probably running out. And Antone was a pretty good place to be because that's where all the mines were, and he could see the need for more lumber, and he thought that he probably marketing would be better up there. Also, he was close to Dayville and close to Mitchell. So Mitchell and Dayville were both building, and the old community hall in downtown Dayville was made from lumber cut from RT's mill.
At Antone.
Yeah, at Antone.
So how did they go about procuring timber at that point? Did they buy it at a timber sale like they do now, or
they would go to the people that owned the land, and they, I think not only that, I think they procured it probably from just, hey, man, that's a nice tree. We're going to haul it down to the mill and cut it. And I don't think at that time the Forest Service didn't have any people out there, and they didn't have any of the people to be watching them. So I'm thinking that some of it might have been kind of pilfered. But mostly they bought it from farmers and ranchers that had timber holdings in the area. RT first moved up to Trosper Place, and so he probably bought most of the lumber or the timber from George Trosper.
And that was a ranch that's kind of in between Dayville and Antone, right? It's kind of up on top, the Trosper Place, or is
it's just right there on Rock Creek.
Oh, that's right. It's further down.
Yeah, but he also had holdings over into the mining claims and everything too. So, and then when he got that done and he cut most of that stuff that was pretty close, he moved up to the Erickson Place, which is just up the hill a ways. So they just kind of cut wherever the timber was available, and then they could move the mill, like I said, a lot quicker than they could move the logs. So. And I remember my dad telling me that I guess this was probably back in the early 30s, probably, and late 20s. He worked up at Antone at Fred Arnicke's place. Now, Fred Arnicke was settled just pretty close to Antone, and he had a lake there, a little pond. And he said they would go up there in the wintertime, and they had built a little building there out of lumber that they had milled there, and they would harvest ice off of this pond. They had these great big ice saws, and they'd go out there and they'd cut this ice, and then they would slide it over to where they had this load into the ice house, raise it up, bring it in, and had it all on slides, and so it was easier to handle. And I think these blocks were probably 50 to 100 pounds. And then they would take the leavings and the sawdust from Brown's mill. They'd bring the ice in there, and they'd stack it, and then they'd cover it and put sawdust on it, and that way they could break it out in the summertime and it wouldn't freeze together. And so they would take that ice and stack it in there, and then they'd put the top sawdust over the top of it, and it kind of provided an insulation for the ice, and it would keep a lot better. And it was really frozen really, really hard when it came out there, and then it just continued to freeze because of the insulation. And then they would
So it would continue to freeze after they cut it and put it in there.
Mm-hmm, yeah. With this insulation and everything, it wouldn't,
It would never thaw.
No. And the reason they did this is because in the summertime when they wanted cold beer or cold anything.
Yeah, you'd have to.
Yeah. And so they just loaded in a wagon, same procedure kind of, and bring it to town. And then they had ice chests, not like we have now, but they're mostly probably metal lined wood boxes is what they were. With what little insulation thing they had, maybe more sawdust, I don't know.
Probably so.
But that way they would keep everything cool in the summertime. So RT had a daughter. He had actually had 2 daughters and I think 2 sons. Anyhow, the daughter, I knew one of the daughters, and as did a lot of people here in Mitchell at the time, because her name was... when I first met her, she was Lila Frisell. She was married to Claude Frisell, and I think they run the liquor store here for part-time sometimes when we had one. And then
where was the liquor store?
It washed away in 1956 flood.
Okay.
It was in that complex there by where the city park is now.
Gotcha.
I remember when it washed away, they posted 2 guards in there because it washed the whole back out, the back end of the building and everything, and all the liquor and everything was exposed. And the 2 guards they hired was probably the 2 biggest drunks in town. So I'm thinking that probably they lost a little there that was just chalked up to flood damage and flood loss.
Maybe that's how they paid them.
No, I think it's kind of like a bartender. They didn't raise their wages because they knew they was going to steal it anyway. Anyhow, her name was Lila, and after the liquor store and everything, she went to work in Norton's General Store, and then later on, she married Deb Fulson. And I called her Granny, and she was just a delight, and she lived to be about 97 years old, and she supplied a lot of the information on this Brown family for Martin Morissette. Like I said, they moved to Antone, set up the mill, cut at the Prosser place, and they moved up to Erickson's place. And they, like I said, they were mining in Mule Gulch and Spanish Gulch, and they were closer to the Prosper place, being closer to the mining deal. So I'm sure they moved up there so we wouldn't have too far to transport the lumber to the mines. And also it was a little closer to the Dayville side. He said that there's another Brown family, no relation to this Brown family, and they were actually the Browns. Fred Brown was a preacher here in this area, and they had a mill, and he had sons Roy, Ivan, and John, and they took their mill and I don't know the location of the mill is what they call Mill. I think it was Indian Creek. Which is up Badger Creek, Mountain Creek, between there and Scott's Camp someplace.
Okay.
And that's where they had their mill set up. So, but anyhow, RT's mill was taken over by their son, Arlie.
Arlie?
Arlie, Arley.
That's an interesting name.
And at that time, I guess they were probably running out of timber, and so they moved the mill, what we used to call the Ray Bland place, which is about 10 miles east of Mitchell on Mountain Creek. There was a big they had a lot of, and they actually bought the land. I think I read where someplace they I think they bought it from Wash Campbell, and that was what they called the Campbell place, and which was happened to be just across the road from my grandfather. That's where he found his wife
Yes.
over at the Campbell place. But anyhow, they sold it out to them, and then they set their mill up there and milled there until about 1936, I think, and then they decided to just close it down. I don't know whether he just had enough or what, but anyhow, I got acquainted with Arlie's son Art, who married into the Humphreys family, which were down at on the John Day River right above Kimberly. Married Gladys Humphrey, but he after they closed the mill, he went to work for he worked both for Erickson's at the Erickson mill, and then he worked for Spoo's mill. And then when that all kind of played out, he moved into California, and he milled the rest of his life down there until he retired. But milling has got quite a history here in this area, and we're going to get into it a little more, and hopefully we can get one of the sons of the Spoo's Mill generation.
Well, yeah, we talked about getting Bill Spoo on here last week, and eventually, once we get more equipment, we will be able to have guests, but right now we're kind of lacking enough microphones.
Yeah, he's already agreed to... I don't know if he knows as much as I do about the thing, because I had talked to him about some of the things, but I'm sure he knew a lot more of the people and everything, and I think there lies the stories that we want to hear of some of the people that came and went in this...
Well, I think he could speak to more what it was like to live on in a mill, and also his family. They started down Northern California with the mills, right? Or they went from here to there.
From here to there.
Okay.
Yeah. They moved down there.
So he just might be able to kind of tell about what it's like to grow up in a mill family.
Right. Yeah, and he remembers how cold it got there in the Spoo's Mill site.
Well, that's one of the coldest places in the county, I think.
Oh yeah. We lived there. I don't exactly know. It had to be probably, I was born in 43, probably, and we moved probably 45. I might have been 2 or 3 years old. I remember the cabins were there was just as much snow drifted inside the cabin there was outside when you woke up in the morning.
Tight.
No, they were single wall construction and everything, but we'll get into that when we get Spoo up here. I remember you couldn't keep the canned milk and the shelves on the which were mostly apple boxes. That was the cabinetry were maybe all apple boxes, but the canned milk wouldn't sit there because both ends had frozen and bulged out, and so they were rounded on both ends, so you couldn't stack them very well.
Yeah, set them on their side.
Yeah. But that's another story for another day, and we're going to come up with a lot more information on that. I think that's probably going to be... Now, we got a thing coming up here this next weekend, next Sunday, I think it is, the 10th, Mother's Day coming up.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so I have a special poem here for the mothers out there.
You want to save it for next week, or you want to do it early?
I'm going to do it early because at my age, the biological clock's ticking. Next week may never come.
You might wake up and find yourself dead.
That's right. Yeah. Well, I wrote this back in 2003, and I wrote it for Beverly Brazil, and she had passed away. And John, our UPS driver, he had called me and wanted to know if I could do something special for Beverly, and I said, yes, I'd love to. And I'm sure, like most of my good stuff, most of this stuff comes directly from God. He just used me as a tool to kind of relay it. But this is for all you mothers out there. When God made mothers, he took his time because he knew perfection had to be achieved. She had to be straight and true as a shaft. This God truly believed. God took a ton of love and filled her heart. And with this act, God felt good because he knew it was just a start. Next, he gave her wisdom to deal with problems in life. Then he threw in a sense of humor because motherhood starts by being a wife. Care and understanding was another ingredient God added to the mother mix. Toughness and strength were blended for future strife and pain in life's fix. God added a dollop of compassion, a pinch more of love just for good measure. God then evaluated his creation, and what he saw gave him great pleasure. Many mothers walk God's land, they mirror his reflection. Every time God looks down, he is rejoiced because he sees he's achieved his perfection. Happy Mother's Day, mothers.
Well, you're going to have to do more next week, so
Well, we can redo it if I make it. Yeah.
I'm sure you have another Mother's Day poem.
Oh, yes, I do. I have it may not be, this is the best one though.
Okay, that's your prime work for Mother's Day.
Yeah, right, yeah.
See, my whole life, folks, you'd have to watch out what you would do, or Dad would write a poem about it.
Yeah, and that goes with everybody around me. And sometimes I don't necessarily have to be there when it happens. I have done research that sometimes took me 2 or 3 years just to get the poem. And sometimes I come up with the last line first, and then I have to go back and write backwards on this thing to make it work. But it works. So,
well, he's definitely entertained the whole entire town for decades now with his poems that he's written about people, and some people like them and some people don't.
Yeah, well,
because the embarrassment factor, but most of the time they're pretty dang good.
If I write a poem about somebody and they don't like it, they don't voice their opinion because they know I might follow up with a sequel poem.
That's true.
Yeah. So I think that's about all I have for this week.
Wow, this is a short one.
I'm sorry.
The BS factor's low.
Well, I got this hat on.
Well, yeah, talk about that hat.
Yeah, I got this old slouch hat on here. It's when my uncle passed away, they were giving away all his stuff that they didn't really want, just kind of a little memorial memento for him. And this came from Ed Sheets Clothing in Hermiston, Oregon, and it's 100% beaver.
Now, who was your uncle?
My uncle was Roy Wheelhouse. He had married my Aunt Mildred.
And Aunt Mildred, was she a Cannon?
Yep. She was my dad's sister.
Okay.
Youngest sister.
Youngest sister.
Yeah.
Well, I remember she died well up into her 80s, didn't she? Or?
Well, I think she might have made 92 or something.
She might have had it. I just remember her. Didn't she run a bar and smoke clove cigarettes?
Yeah, she smoked about anything, I think.
Oh.
And she drank about anything, but she was a character, and she was a teacher. She had went to Oregon Normal School, which is now Oregon State, for whatever time it was to become a teacher. And then she taught around a lot of these little country schools up here, like a lot of people did. That's another story we're going to have to cover one of these days.
Schoolhouses.
Yeah, schoolhouses and people that taught school to some of these kids.
Well, I think basically these kind of first runs of these podcasts are just kind of getting our feet wet on certain subjects that we're going to have to go back and revisit and dig in deeper to. This is just kind of an overview, a start, because there's a lot more depth than what we're covering at the moment.
Yeah, this I'm going to tell you a few exploits of what Wheelhouse did. One winter, the Columbia River froze over, and they was living at Arlington. That's where he was from, anyhow. Anyhow, they said old Roy, he slapped on a pair of ice skates, and he skated. He's one of the few people that skated across the Columbia River.
Oh, dang.
Quite dangerous, because if you'd went in there at that time, there were no dams or anything. So if he'd went in under, the current would have taken him in. He never got back up. But
it must have been pretty frozen, though.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure it was. And then I don't know what the name of the island was, but there used to be an old hotel on it. I think it might be Blaylock Island. But anyhow, he went out there with him and Mildred went out there on one year, and I think they had some sheep out there that they were grazing off that island, and it was quite an experience there then. But he and Roy Philippi were good friends, and they got into a lot of stuff. I mean, they told me that they used to go over there and they'd take plastic sheeting and put it in the wheat fields there out of Arlington and Condon and bait the geese. And when the geese had come over, they'd think it was like water or something. They'd try to land on it, and they'd get quite a few. They shoot quite a few geese there.
Oh, so they kind of like make them think that they were landing on a pond.
Yeah, right.
And then they
yeah.
just shoot them as they land.
Yeah, that's one of the stories I heard. Also, I heard that they'd hike into the falls on the John Day River, and actually it was named, I think, Philippi Falls, and they would scoop up all the fish that they could get, and sometimes they get more than they could almost pack out of there.
Where's Philippi Falls on?
It's a lower end. It's not too far from the mouth of the river John Day.
I'll be dang. I didn't know about that. Are they, they drift boats. They run boats through there, so they can't be too big of falls, can they?
Well, I don't think they're that big, but they were big enough that the fish would congregate down below the falls, and they could really just...
Well, I guess back in the day, though, too, there wasn't any dams on the Columbia, so that big old, as you're going across the mouth of the John Day now, is dammed up from one of the dams there.
Yeah, right.
I should know which.
John Day Dam, probably.
Well, there you go. That makes sense.
Yeah, that's another thing. I can remember going down to the Slilo Falls and watching the Indian fish and buying fish.
Nice.
We were down there once, and I wasn't there, but it was a little bit before my time, but they told me that all the cannons went down there, and that they would do this every year so they could buy their fish and dry the fish and all that stuff, and so I'm trying to think. Jim, he asked them if he could fish off the platform, catch one in one of the nets and everything, and he said, no, fish. Turned to his brother, which was Anthony Tone, and he said, he fish. He was a little darker complected, and he thought he was Indian, so he could fish. But,
well, there might be that Cherokee blood from Kentucky.
Whatever. We don't talk about that much.
Why?
I don't know. No money involved, I guess.
Well, I know when I lived in Portland, it was pretty neat because when the salmon would run, Native Americans would come into the neighborhood that I lived in, and they would sell pretty decent sized salmon.
Oh yeah,
you can get a pretty good fish for a decent deal.
Well, yeah, if they stayed sober, but if they get a little money, sometimes they get drunk too quick. Sometimes the fish are pretty rancid time you get a hold of them.
Well, I think that depends on the salesman.
Well, maybe, but I bought one once. I brought it home, and it wasn't that good. No,
okay.
No. This Indian had kept it out of ice too long or something. I don't know. But
it might have been the last one in the barrel.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Maybe you should have been more picky.
Yeah. yeah. It might have been my fault, not his. Well,
Well, let's call her good.
That's good. We got enough time in now?
Yeah, well,
okay.
It doesn't matter. We're not trying to beat a clock.
Oh, no.
Or to defeat a clock.
That's right. I don't know anything else that's going on, but other than Mother's Day next week, and then we got Memorial Day coming up.
Yep, I want to do something good for Memorial Day.
Yeah, we plan on doing some veteran stuff for Memorial Day, I think, and I've got that mostly prepared already.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Well, you got plenty of material on that, I know. All right, folks. Well, that does it for us today, and please be forgiven on us some of our slackadaisical podcast situations. Anyways, hope you all are doing pretty good out there.
May the good Lord take a liking to you.